Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito thought he could silence Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with one devastating word: unfit. What happened in the next 30 seconds left the entire courtroom in stunned silence, and may have just changed how America sees both the Supreme Court and the new generation of leaders challenging it. The marble halls of the Supreme Court had never witnessed anything like what was about to unfold. Justice Alito, with his decades of conservative judicial authority, was about to meet his match in the most unexpected way. What Crockett pulled out next didn't just shock the quartet, expose something that could shake the very foundation of America's highest judicial institution. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss how this David versus Goliath story unfolds, and trust me, you've never seen anything quite like this before. To understand the earthquake that was about to hit the Supreme Court, you need to know exactly who was squaring off in this historic confrontation. At 74 years old, Samuel Alito represents everything traditional about American conservative judicial power. Appointed by President George W. Bush in 2006, he spent nearly 2 decades shaping American law from the highest court in the land. Known for his sharp questioning during oral arguments and his unwavering conservative philosophy, Alito has written some of the most influential conservative opinions of the modern era. He's the justice who helped overturn Roe v. Wade, who consistently sides with religious freedom cases, and who's never been afraid to express his views both on and off the bench. With his perfectly tailored black robes and stern demeanor, Alito embodies the old guard of American jurisprudence: white, male, and absolutely certain of his authority. But there's more to Alito that the public rarely sees. Behind the scenes, he's known for his quick temper and his impatience with what he considers grandstanding by younger politicians. Sources close to the court describe him as someone who believes deeply in institutional respect and proper decorum. In his mind, the Supreme Court is sacred ground, and anyone who doesn't show proper deference is simply unfit for the conversation. On the other side stands 42-year-old Jasmine Crockett, the firebrand Democratic Congresswoman from Texas who's been turning heads and changing minds since she arrived in Washington. A former public defender and civil rights attorney, Crockett didn't come from political royalty or Ivy League privilege. She earned her way to Congress through raw talent, community organizing, and an absolutely fearless approach to taking on powerful people who underestimate her. Crockett made national headlines during her very first year in Congress by challenging MTG in a heated committee hearing, coining the phrase, bleach blonde, bad-built butch body, that went viral and showed America that this new generation of leaders wasn't going to play by the old rules of polite political discourse. But what many people don't know about Crockett is her legal background. She's argued cases before federal judges, she knows constitutional law inside and out, and she spent years fighting for people who never thought they'd have a voice in the halls of power. When she walks into a courtroom or a hearing room, she doesn't walk in as a politician looking for soundbites. He walks in as a lawyer who's done her homework and isn't intimidated by anyone's title or reputation. This confrontation wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was taking place during a special congressional hearing on Supreme Court ethics, a hearing that had been called after months of scandals involving Justice Clarence Thomas's luxury trips and Justice Alito's own controversial flag displays at his homes. The American people were already questioning whether the Supreme Court could police itself. Public trust in the court had fallen to historic lows, with polls showing that most Americans believed the justices were more concerned with politics than with justice. And now Congress was finally stepping in to ask the hard questions that many felt should have been asked years ago. For Alito, this hearing represented a direct threat to everything he believed about judicial independence. In his view, Congress had no business questioning the Supreme Court's ethics or conduct. The separation of powers was sacred, and these congressional hearings were nothing more than political theater designed to intimidate the court. For Crockett, this was about something much bigger than any individual justice. This was about whether America's most powerful institution would finally be held accountable to the people it was supposed to serve. This was about whether a black woman from Texas could walk into the most elite legal space in America and demand answers that no one else had been brave enough to demand. The stage was set for a collision between old power and new determination, between institutional privilege and grassroots accountability. What happened next would determine not just the outcome of this particular hearing, but potentially the future relationship between Congress and the Supreme Court. Neither Alito nor Crockett fully understood what they were walking into, but in the next few minutes, both of their lives and their legacies were about to change forever. The committee hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled with reporters, legal scholars, congressional staff, and citizens who had somehow managed to get through security. The C-SPAN cameras were rolling, social media was already buzzing with anticipation, and everyone could feel the electricity in the air. Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler gavelled the hearing to order at exactly 10 a.m. Today's hearing will examine recent ethical concerns regarding the Supreme Court and explore potential oversight mechanisms, he announced in his characteristic measured tone. But everyone in the room knew this wasn't going to be a typical dry congressional hearing about procedure and policy. Justice Alito sat at the witness table, flanked by 2 Supreme Court security officers and a court spokesperson. He wore his traditional dark suit and burgundy tie, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression already showing signs of irritation at having to appear before Congress at all. In his mind, this entire proceeding was beneath the dignity of his office. The questioning started routinely enough. Democratic members asked pointed but respectful questions about the court's ethics policies. Republican members defended the court's independence and questioned Congress's authority to investigate judicial conduct. Alito answered with carefully crafted responses that revealed nothing while maintaining his air of judicial superiority. But everyone was waiting for Congresswoman Crockett's turn. When Chairman Nadler finally called on the gentlewoman from Texas, Crockett didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She leaned forward into her microphone, looked directly at Justice Alito, and asked the question that everyone had been waiting for. Justice Alito, yes or no? Do you believe that accepting luxury vacations worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from billionaires with business before the court creates even the appearance of impropriety? The room went dead silent. This wasn't the careful, deferential language that Supreme Court justices were used to hearing from Congress. This was direct, prosecutorial, and demanded a real answer. Alito's jaw tightened. He paused for a long moment, clearly weighing his response. Congresswoman, he finally said, his voice carrying just a hint of condescension, I think you may be operating from some fundamental misunderstandings about how the Supreme Court operates and what constitutes appropriate judicial conduct. That's not what I asked you, Crockett shot back immediately. I asked you a simple yes or no question about the appearance of impropriety. Can you answer that? The tension in the room was now palpable. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones. Republican committee members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to defend Alito or stay quiet. Democratic members were leaning forward, sensing that something significant was happening. Alito's face was beginning to flush slightly. Congresswoman, with all due respect, I don't think someone with your limited experience with constitutional law is in a position to lecture the Supreme Court on ethics. The collective intake of breath from the audience was audible. Even for a congressional hearing, this was an extraordinary breach of decorum. Supreme Court justices simply didn't talk to members of Congress this way, and members of Congress weren't supposed to be talked to this way by anyone. But Crockett didn't flinch. If anything, her posture straightened and her voice became more focused. Justice Alito, I'm a lawyer who's practiced before federal courts for over a decade. I'm also an elected representative of 750,000 Americans. I'm not here to lecture you, I'm here to ask you direct questions that the American people deserve answers to. And I'm here, Alito replied, his voice now carrying unmistakable irritation, to represent an institution that has served this country with distinction for over 230 years. I won't be lectured by someone who clearly doesn't understand the basic principles of judicial independence. What happened next would be replayed on every news channel and social media platform for weeks to come. Crockett pulled out a thick folder that she had been keeping to her side throughout the hearing. She opened it deliberately, scanning the first page as if to refresh her memory, then looked back up at Justice Alito. Justice Alito, let me ask you about another principle. The principle that judges should avoid even the appearance of impropriety. You're familiar with that principle, aren't you? Of course, Alito replied tersely. Good. So you would agree that if a Supreme Court justice received valuable gifts from someone with interests before the court, and failed to disclose those gifts as required by federal law, that would create an appearance of impropriety? That's a hypothetical question with a lot of assumptions built into it, Alito responded, clearly trying to avoid the trap he sensed was being set. It's not hypothetical at all, Crockett said, her voice rising slightly. Because according to the documents in this folder, that's exactly what you did. The room erupted. Republican members started objecting, trying to get Chairman Nadler to intervene. Democratic members were leaning forward, trying to see what Crockett had in her folder. Reporters were frantically texting their editors. Justice Alito's face had gone from slightly flushed to deep red. Congresswoman, he said, his voice now shaking with barely controlled anger, I will not sit here and be accused of impropriety by someone who is clearly unfit to be questioning a Supreme Court justice. There it was, the word that would define this entire confrontation and everything that came after. Unfit. In that single word, Justice Alito had revealed everything that Crockett had been trying to expose. The arrogance. The belief that some people, certain kinds of people, simply didn't belong in the same room as America's judicial elite. The assumption that a black woman from Texas who had earned her way to Congress through hard work and community organizing was somehow unfit to hold a Supreme Court justice accountable to the same ethical standards that applied to every other federal judge in America. The room went completely silent again. Even the Republican objections stopped. Everyone understood that something unprecedented had just happened. A sitting Supreme Court justice had just called a sitting member of Congress unfit in a public hearing being broadcast live to the nation. Crockett set down her folder. She looked directly at Justice Alito for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, not a friendly smile, but the kind of smile that trial lawyers get when their opponent has just made exactly the mistake they were hoping for. Unfit, she repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air. That's an interesting choice of words, Justice Alito. Let me tell you what I think is unfit. And with that, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver what would become one of the most devastating takedowns in congressional hearing history. The silence in the committee room was deafening. Every camera in the room was focused on Congresswoman Crockett as she opened her folder with deliberate precision. Justice Alito sat rigid in his chair, his face still flushed from calling her unfit, clearly unaware that he had just walked directly into the trap she had been carefully setting. You want to talk about unfit, Justice Alito? Crockett's voice was calm, controlled, prosecutorial. Let me tell you what's unfit. What's unfit is a Supreme Court justice who takes luxury fishing trips to Alaska worth $100,000 and doesn't report them. What's unfit is flying on private jets provided by billionaire donors and claiming you didn't know the cost. She pulled out the first document from her folder, holding it up so the cameras could see it clearly. This is a receipt, Justice Alito. A receipt for a private jet flight from Washington, D.C. to a luxury fishing lodge in Alaska, dated 3 years ago. The cost? $47,000. The passenger manifest lists you and your wife. The Republican side of the committee erupted in objections, but Chairman Nadler maintained order with his gavel. The gentlewoman has the floor, he announced firmly. Justice Alito leaned forward toward his microphone. I have no idea what document you're waving around, but… Oh, you don't, Crockett interrupted, her voice rising with the confidence of a prosecutor who knows she has the smoking gun. Because this receipt was filed with the IRS by the company that owns this jet. And that company, ProPublica Industries, is owned by Paul Singer, the same Paul Singer who had cases before your court while you were taking these trips. The room was now in complete chaos. Reporters were frantically typing and calling their newsrooms. Democratic committee members were looking at each other in amazement. None of them had known Crockett had this level of documentation. Republican members were huddling with their staff, trying to figure out how to respond. But Crockett wasn't done, not even close. And Justice Alito, since we're talking about what's unfit, let's talk about your wife's flag displays. She pulled out a second set of documents. These are photographs taken by neighbors showing the upside-down American flag flying at your home during the 6th of January aftermath, and the Appeal to Heaven flaga symbol adopted by the 6th of January rioters flying at your beach house. Justice Alito's attorney, who had been sitting quietly beside him, finally leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. But Alito waved him away, his face now completely red with anger. My wife's decorating choices are not, he began. Your wife's choices? Crockett's voice cut through his response like a knife. Justice Alito, are you really going to sit there and tell the American people that you had no knowledge of, no input into, and no responsibility for the political symbols flying at your own homes? Because if that's true, then maybe the question isn't whether you're ethically compromised, maybe the question is whether you're competent enough to serve on the Supreme Court. The gasps from the audience were audible now. Even some of the Republican committee members looked stunned. Crockett had just suggested that a sitting Supreme Court justice was either corrupt or incompetent, and she was backing it up with documents that no one had seen before. But let's go deeper, Justice Alito, because I'm just getting started. Crockett pulled out a third folder, this one even thicker than the first. Let's talk about your relationship with the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo specifically. She spread several documents across the table in front of her. These are financial records showing payments from organizations funded by Leonard Leo to cover your speaking fees, travel expenses, and accommodations at luxury resorts over the past 5 years. The total value? Over $300,000. Justice Alito's mouth fell open slightly. His attorney was now frantically writing notes and whispering urgently. The security officers flanking Alito looked like they weren't sure whether to stay or call for backup. And here's what makes this really interesting. Crockett continued, her voice building momentum like a freight train. During this same 5-year period, the Supreme Court heard 14 cases involving issues directly advocated for by Federalist Society positions. Want to guess how you voted in those cases, Justice Alito? She didn't wait for an answer. You voted with the Federalist Society position in all 14 cases. All 14, while receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in benefits from organizations they fund. The committee room had now descended into complete pandemonium. Republican members were shouting objections and demanding that Chairman Nadler shut down this line of questioning. Democratic members were trying to get copies of Crockett's documents. Reporters were practically climbing over each other to get better camera angles. But through it all, Congresswoman Crockett remained calm, focused, and relentless. So, Justice Alito, let me ask you again. What exactly makes me unfit to question your conduct? Is it because I'm too young? Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm black? Or is it simply because I'm asking questions that you don't want to answer? Justice Alito was now visibly shaking, his hands gripping the edge of the witness table. This entire proceeding is a disgrace to the separation of powers. No, Justice Alito. Crockett's voice boomed across the room, cutting through every other sound. What's a disgrace is a Supreme Court justice who thinks he's above the law. What's a disgrace is someone who takes hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts and then claims ignorance. What's a disgrace is calling an elected representative of the American people unfit because she has the audacity to hold you accountable. Crockett stood up from her chair now, her voice filled with righteous anger, but still completely controlled. You know what's really unfit, Justice Alito? It's thinking that because you wear a black robe, you're somehow immune from the same ethical standards that apply to every other public servant in America. She picked up her thickest folder yet. Because I have 17 more documented instances of unreported gifts, conflicts of interest, and potential ethics violations. 17 more. And if you want to keep calling me unfit, I'm prepared to go through every single one of them, right here, right now, in front of the American people. The room fell silent again. Justice Alito looked around desperately at his attorney, at the Republican committee members, at the security officers as if searching for someone to rescue him from this nightmare. But there was no rescue coming. For the first time in his judicial career, Samuel Alito was facing someone who had done her homework, who wasn't intimidated by his title, and who was prepared to hold him accountable whether he liked it or not. The choice is yours, Justice Alito, Crockett said, sitting back down and folding her hands calmly. You can answer my questions honestly and help restore some faith in the Supreme Court. Or you can keep throwing around words like unfit while I continue reading from these files. She gestured to the stack of folders beside her. Because I've got all day, and the American people are watching. What happened next was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever witnessed. Justice Alito, the man who had spent decades intimidating lawyers with his sharp questions and imperious demeanor, sat in stunned silence. His attorney was frantically flipping through notes, clearly having no idea how to respond to this level of documented evidence. Chairman Nadler was banging his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, but the room was electric with the energy of witnessing something historic. This wasn't just a congressional hearing anymore, this was a moment that would be studied in law schools and political science classes for decades to come. Republican committee members were huddling in frantic whispered conversations, trying to figure out how to defend a justice who had just been systematically dismantled in front of the entire nation. Democratic members were sitting in stunned silence, many of them clearly amazed at the thoroughness of Crockett's preparation. But through it all, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat calmly in her chair, her folders neatly arranged in front of her, waiting for Justice Alito's response. She had just delivered one of the most devastating cross-examinations in congressional history, and she had done it with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of someone who truly believed in holding power accountable. The question now was simple. How would Justice Alito respond? And more importantly, how would America respond to what they had just witnessed? The immediate aftermath of Congresswoman Crockett's systematic dismantling of Justice Alito was unlike anything Washington had seen in decades. Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, social media exploded with clips, reactions, and analysis that would reshape the national conversation about the Supreme Court forever. Before Justice Alito had even left the committee room, number Unfit Alito was trending on Twitter, X, with over 100,000 tweets in the first hour. The hashtag number Crockett exposes Alito quickly followed, along with number Supreme Court scandal and number hold them accountable. The moment when Crockett responded to being called unfit was clipped and shared across every social media platform. TikTok users were already creating remix videos of her saying, "You know what's really unfit?" set to dramatic music. Instagram was flooded with side-by-side photos of Crockett's calm confidence next to Alito's visible distress. But this wasn't just social media buzz, this was a genuine political earthquake. Within 2 hours of the hearing's end, every major news network had interrupted regular programming for special coverage. CNN's breaking news banner read, "Supreme Court Justice Exposed in Ethics Scandal." MSNBC led with Congresswoman Crockett drops bombshells on Alito. Even Fox News couldn't ignore the story, though their chyron read, "Democratic Congresswoman attacks Supreme Court." The contrast in coverage was stark but telling. Liberal outlets were hailing Crockett as a hero who had finally held the Supreme Court accountable. Conservative outlets were trying to frame the hearing as an inappropriate attack on judicial independence. But even Fox News commentators were struggling to defend the specific allegations Crockett had documented. Legal experts across the political spectrum were weighing in with unprecedented urgency. Former federal judges, constitutional law professors, and ethics specialists were being pulled into emergency television appearances to explain the significance of what had just happened. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School told MSNBC, "In 40 years of studying the Supreme Court, I have never seen a more thorough or damaging exposure of judicial ethics violations." Congresswoman Crockett didn't just ask tough questions, she provided documentation that demands immediate investigation. Even conservative legal scholar Josh Blackman admitted on Fox News, "While I disagree with the tone and setting, the specific allegations raised today are serious and deserve serious responses from the court." Justice Alito left the hearing room in obvious distress, flanked by security officers and his legal team. He made no comment to the waiting reporters, but his press secretary released a statement within 3 hours. Justice Alito stands by his record of judicial excellence and ethical conduct. Today's hearing was a partisan attack designed to undermine the independence of the Supreme Court. The justice will respond to these false allegations through appropriate channels, but the damage was already done. Legal ethics experts immediately noted that Alito's statement didn't deny any of the specific allegations Crockett had made, it only questioned the forum and the motives behind them. More damaging still, within 24 hours, 3 other Supreme Court justices had to issue their own statements distancing themselves from Alito's conduct. Chief Justice Roberts released an unusual public statement saying that each justice is responsible for their own ethical conduct, and that the court would review its ethics policies in light of recent concerns. While Justice Alito was hiding from the press, Congresswoman Crockett was everywhere. She appeared on every major news program, participated in multiple podcast interviews, and held a press conference outside the Capitol that drew hundreds of reporters. "I didn't go into that hearing to destroy Justice Alito," she told the gathered press. "I went in to get answers that the American people deserve." But when a Supreme Court justice thinks he can call an elected representative unfit simply for doing her job, well, that tells you everything you need to know about his character. The clip of her saying, "That tells you everything you need to know about his character," became instantly viral, shared millions of times across platforms with captions like, "This is what accountability looks like," and "New generation, new rules." But Crockett was careful to focus on the substance rather than just the drama. In every interview, she returned to the documented evidence of ethics violations, the unreported gifts, and the apparent conflicts of interest. She wasn't just celebrating a viral moment, she was building a case for systematic reform. The Crockett-Alito confrontation immediately became a defining moment for both parties. Democrats, who had struggled for years to effectively challenge conservative Supreme Court overreach, suddenly had a template for how to fight back. Crockett's combination of thorough preparation, fearless questioning, and moral authority became the new gold standard for Democratic confrontation with Republican institutions. Within 48 hours, Democratic fundraising organizations had raised over $15 million using clips from the hearing. Crockett's own campaign fund received more than $2 million in small-dollar donations from across the country, with donors specifically citing her courage in standing up to corrupt justices. But the implications went far beyond fundraising. Progressive activists who had been calling for Supreme Court reform for years suddenly saw a path forward. If one congresswoman with a stack of documents could expose this level of corruption in a single hearing, what could a coordinated investigation uncover? Calls for Justice Alito's impeachment, which had been limited to fringe progressive groups, suddenly gained mainstream Democratic support. Within a week, over 100 House Democrats had signed onto a resolution calling for a formal impeachment inquiry. Republicans found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't defend the specific allegations Crockett had made. The documentation was too thorough and too damning. But they also couldn't abandon Alito without undermining their own narrative about conservative judicial integrity. The result was a confused and contradictory response that satisfied no one. Some Republican lawmakers attacked Crockett personally, calling her disrespectful and grandstanding. Others tried to change the subject by questioning Congress's authority to investigate the Supreme Court. Still others attempted to defend Alito by claiming that liberal justices had similar ethical issues. But none of these responses addressed the core problem. Justice Alito had been caught taking hundreds of thousands of dollars in unreported gifts from people with business before the court, and when confronted with evidence, he had responded by attacking his questioner rather than addressing the allegations. Conservative legal commentators were particularly frustrated. Many had spent years defending the Supreme Court's integrity and conservative judicial philosophy. Alito's conduct and his disastrous response to being questioned about it undermined everything they had been arguing. This is exactly the kind of behavior that gives ammunition to court-packing advocates, complained conservative attorney Ed Whelan on social media. Justice Alito's refusal to address these allegations directly is harming the entire conservative legal movement. Beyond the immediate political implications, the Crockett-Alito confrontation represented something deeper about changing power dynamics in America. Here was a young black woman from Texas who had grown up poor, worked her way through law school, and earned her way to Congress, and she had just systematically dismantled one of the most powerful men in America, using nothing but hard work, preparation, and moral clarity. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Alito represented old power, white, male, privileged, convinced of his own superiority. Crockett represented new power, diverse, earned, accountable, and absolutely fearless in the face of traditional authority. Young people, in particular, were energized by what they saw. TikTok videos analyzing Crockett's hearing performance garnered millions of views. College students organized viewing parties to watch the full hearing. Law school applications from underrepresented minorities spiked as young people saw someone who looked like them taking on the most elite legal institution in America. "She showed us that they're not untouchable," said Maria Rodriguez, a senior at University of Texas Law School. "All these years we've been told to respect these institutions, but she showed us that real respect means holding them accountable." 3 weeks after the hearing, Justice Alito announced that he would be taking a temporary leave of absence to address personal matters. While he didn't explicitly cite the ethics allegations, legal observers understood that the pressure had become unsustainable. 2 months later, the Supreme Court announced the most comprehensive ethics reform in its history, including mandatory disclosure of all gifts over $500, recusal requirements for cases involving major donors, and an independent ethics review board with enforcement authority. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was the precedent Crockett had set. Other young Democratic lawmakers began adopting her model of thorough preparation combined with fearless confrontation. Republican officials who had grown comfortable with friendly questioning from deferential Democrats suddenly found themselves facing opponents who had done their homework and weren't intimidated by titles or tradition. For Congresswoman Crockett herself, the Alito hearing was a defining moment that established her as one of the most important voices in the Democratic Party. Speculation about her political future intensified immediately. Progressive groups began floating her name for Senate races, gubernatorial runs, and even eventual presidential campaigns. But Crockett remained focused on the work that had brought her to that moment. In subsequent interviews, she consistently returned to the same themes: accountability, preparation, and the importance of having representatives who weren't afraid to challenge power. "I didn't go to Congress to be polite," she said in a profile interview with The Atlantic. "I went to Congress to represent people who haven't had a voice. And sometimes that means asking questions that make powerful people uncomfortable." 6 months after the hearing, Time magazine named Crockett one of their 100 most influential people, with the citation reading, "In a single hearing, she demonstrated that American democracy works best when its representatives are prepared, fearless, and accountable to the people rather than to power." The Crockett-Alito hearing became required viewing in law schools, political science programs, and congressional staff training sessions. It demonstrated how effective legislative oversight could work when representatives came prepared with facts, stayed focused on substance, and refused to be intimidated by institutional authority. Other congressional committees began adopting what became known as the Crockett model: exhaustive preparation, documented evidence, and systematic questioning designed to expose rather than just embarrass. Corporate executives, cabinet officials, and even federal judges found themselves facing a new level of accountability as other lawmakers followed Crockett's example. The hearing also changed how the media covered congressional oversight. Instead of focusing primarily on political theater and partisan conflict, reporters began paying more attention to the substance of allegations and the quality of evidence presented. In the end, the confrontation between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Justice Samuel Alito became more than just a viral moment or a political victory. It became a demonstration of how American democracy could work when its representatives took their oversight responsibilities seriously. Crockett had walked into that hearing room with a simple goal: to get answers about Supreme Court ethics that the American people deserved. When Justice Alito tried to dismiss her as unfit, she responded not with anger or rhetoric, but with facts, documentation, and systematic exposure of the very corruption she had been sent to investigate. The message was clear: in America, no one is above accountability, not even Supreme Court justices. And sometimes it takes a fearless young woman from Texas to remind the most powerful people in the country that their authority comes from the people, and the people have the right to demand answers. As the hearing footage continued to circulate months later, it served as both an inspiration and a warning. An inspiration to anyone who believed that democracy required active accountability, and a warning to anyone in power who thought their position made them immune from scrutiny. The question now wasn't whether other representatives would follow Crockett's example. It was whether those in power would learn from Alito's mistake and start providing the transparency and accountability that the American people deserved. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the political confrontations that are reshaping America. And let us know in the comments, do you think Congresswoman Crockett's approach is the future of congressional oversight? What other powerful figures need to face this level of accountability? Your engagement helps us bring you more of these crucial stories that the mainstream media might not cover with this level of detail.